Shabbat Shalom.
Oh,
So, hopefully everybody present in the sanctuary, sorry to you folks on Zoom, have a copy of the text that I want us to look at. It's some selected, Mishnayot from Tractate Sukkah dealing specifically with Lulav and Shabbat. Okay, now, so we're not gonna look at the first Mishnah because we could spend months on that. It's deeply problematic. Enough said. The second Mishnah we actually discussed last night. So we'll look at the rest, maybe not all of them, you know, I know it's running. We had Hallel a little bit late, but the question, first of all, before we look specifically at the text of the Mishnah, why do we not take the lulav on Shabbat? And why do we not blow the shofar on Shabbat? Why?
well, search you did it because it's considered work, but it really isn't, it's not creating a spark or any of that stuff.
Right.
Is it because of the day of rest, we're supposed to remember doing this, we're supposed to remember blowing the shofar?
No, I mean, that's good, but it's not correct. Yeah.
Are we not supposed to carry, something to the synagogue and then back or something?
Right, exactly. There is nothing intrinsic to either blowing the shofar or taking the lulav that violates Shabbat. The issue is bringing the lulav to shul on Shabbat or bringing the shofar. Actually, the Mishnah doesn't even say about bringing the shofar to shul on Shabbat. It says that you might realize that you don't know how to blow it, so you would carry the shofar to the house of somebody who knows for them to teach you, okay? But so, if we posit correctly that the reason we don't do those things on Shabbat is because we can't bring them to shul on Shabbat, right? Why not simply say, bring them before Shabbat, right? Why not simply say, bring them before Shabbat? And I don't know if any of you had a son born on Shabbat who needed a bris on Shabbat, or maybe if not you, then you've been there, right? The moil, right? You have a bris on Shabbat because the bris overrides Shabbat. Bringing the equipment does not override Shabbat, right? Let alone bringing the babies, right? So if the moil is observing, what the moil should be, they're gonna, right, they're gonna come, but even if they live in the neighborhood, okay? They're gonna come to your house Friday to drop off the equipment, right? Because so why don't we say, so bring the lulav to the shul on Shabbat, okay? Or why don't we say, well, if you live inside the Eruv, right? We'll do lulav on Shabbat, or we'll do it on Rosh Hashanah. And I remember very well, in 2020, right, almost every shul in the world, and certainly every non-Orthodox shul in the world, in 2020, we were exclusively on Zoom. Right, I can't remember like those long ago days, right? Because we've all like wiped it out from our memories, right? But we were all on Zoom. So the fear of bringing the shofar to the shul on Shabbat, not a worry. The fear of bringing the lulav to the shul on Shabbat, not a worry. And there definitely were discussions among conservative rabbis maybe we should do it this year. Okay, and I am actually not aware of anybody who actually concluded that we should, because there is this concept in halacha called la food. La food, which means we are wary of creating fine distinctions that we rabbis might understand, but lay people might not. Right, so that if we had said in 2020, we'll blow the shofar on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, even though it's Shabbat, we'll do lulav and etrog the first day of Sukkot, even though it's Shabbat. Then in 2023, people will say, "We did it in 2020, why didn't you do it to this year?" Right? So, no, not gonna deal with it, right? Not gonna deal with it. So, or, people say exactly that, right? Well, I went to my uncle's shul and he's very orthodox, right? Because people are always very orthodox, they're never too big orthodox. My uncle is very orthodox, which could mean he lives in Baltimore and doesn't eat crabs. Right? But my uncle is very orthodox and they blew the shofar, even though it was Shabbat. And you say, yes, but your uncle lives shul in the neighborhood, we're not, no. No, okay, we don't deal with that, so we have a universal blanket prohibition. Okay, so, now we'll get to the Mishnah. Right, so initially, this is the third Mishnah. Initially, the lulav would be taken in the temple on each of the 7 days of the festival, and in the country, i.e., anywhere outside of the temple, it would be taken on one day, the first day only. Okay, so now the question for that is why? I mean, because if you look at it, the biblical command says, "V'lakachtem lachem bayom harishon." You shall take for yourselves on the first day. Okay, so the biblical mitzvah of lulav and etrog is only on the first day. So when the temple stood, everywhere other than the temple, they only did lulav and etrog on the first day. But in the temple, they did it all 7 days. But once the temple was destroyed, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said that the lulav should be taken everywhere on all 7 in commemoration of the temple. Okay, and I have pointed out before, again, not going to get by now, where there are certain things that we do, and we are told we do them because they did them in the temple. Right? And there are other things that we do not do. And we do not do them because they did them in the temple. Right? I have yet to establish a rhyme or reason as to why certain things we do them because they did them in the temple, and certain things we're forbidden to do them because they did them in the temple. Right? In either case, it's supposed to remind us of the temple. But there is a distinction between the first day, where lulav and etrog is a biblical, a Torah mitzvah, and the other 7 days when it's only a rabbinic mitzvah. Okay. So if the first day of the festival falls on Shabbat, the entire nation would walk their lulavim to the synagogue and leave them there before Shabbat. Okay, so the temple is destroyed, but there's still the Sanhedrin. So there's a central authority, and the Sanhedrin felt that it could make sure that people would really do that. Okay, and once there was no more Sanhedrin, right? Right, I mean, I can imagine if I said, well, everybody should bring their lulav before Shabbat. Yeah, right. I mean, right, people don't do what the rabbis tell them to do anymore, right? So we don't do that anymore. But when there was a Sanhedrin, everybody would bring their lulav to the shul, leave them before Shabbat. The next day they would wake up and come, and each and everyone would recognize his own and take it. For the Sage says one does not fulfill one's obligation on the first day of the festival by means of the lulav of one's fellow, but on the rest of the days of the festival, one does, right? And if you were here on the first day of Shabbat, I'm very careful to say, I am making you a gift of this lulav, right? Or in the case of like the extra one that we had for the shul, on behalf of the shul, I am making you the gift of this lulav, right? And then that person certainly, because once it's yours, right? If you want to make a gift of it to another person, you can do that, right? But why do we go through that? Because it says, "V'lakachtem lachem b'yom harishon." You shall take for yourself on the first day. So on the first day, you can only fulfill the mitzvah of lulav and etrog with a lulav and etrog that you own. Okay, but the rest of Sukkot, you can borrow a lulav and etrog and still, because it doesn't say v'lakachtem lachem b'yom hasheni, v'lakachtem lachem b'yom hashlishi, right? You shall take for yourself on the first day. Doesn't say you shall take for yourself on the second day, right? So everyone, you'd bring your lulav to the shul, but then when you got to the shul on Shabbos, you had to make sure that it was yours that you found. Okay, Brian, did you ever handle? No? Okay. Rabbi Yosef says if the first day of the festival falls on Shabbat and one forgot and took one's lulav out into the public domain, he is exempt because he took it out with permission. Okay, now for Yosef, I mean, if it's attributed to Yosef, that may not be the halakha. I mean, it's certainly not the halakha for us anyway, right? So it doesn't really matter, but Rabbi Yosef had the opinion that, you should bring it to shul before Shabbos, but if you don't, and you carried it anyway, that was okay. Now, how is the shaking of the lulav done on 7 days? Right? If the first holy day of the festival falls on Shabbat, the shaking of the lulav is done on 7 days. And if the first holy day of the festival falls on any of the other days of the week, the shaking of the lulav is done on 6, right? Now, again, this is not what we follow, but this is what they followed when the Sanhedrin stood. In other words, right? So if the first day of Sukkot is on Shabbat, then we have 7 days of lulav. If it's not on Shabbat, we have 6 days of lulav, right? Now, there's a corollary in there, which is not made explicit. Why do we only have 6 days of lulav if the first day is not on Shabbat? Right, in other words, we don't have, if the first day of Sukkot is Shabbat, we do not have a Shabbat Hol HaMoed, right? And therefore, we do it on 7 days, right? But if the first day is not Shabbat, then we have a Shabbat Hol HaMoed, and therefore it's only 6 days. Today, with Shabbat Hol HaMoed, we do not do lulav and etrog, therefore it's only 6 days. Okay, now here, this is the last one, and this is, to me, the fun one. Okay, how is the mitzvah to take the lulav done when the first holy day of the festival falls on Shabbat? All right, and I think that this means when the temple stood, probably, although not necessarily, because they could have gone up to the Temple Mount anyway, even though there was no temple. But anyway, they would walk their lulavim to the Temple Mount, and the officers would receive the lulavim from them and arrange them on top of the colonnade, and the elders would place theirs in the chamber. And they would instruct that the people to say, anyone whom my lulav comes into his possession, it is thereby his as a gift, right? Just like we did on the first day of Yom Tov, right? So, but this is conditional and anticipatory, right? As opposed to when we did it, it was like, here, this is now yours, right? A conditional and anticipatory because, there's a gazillion lulavs, right? And frankly, one lulav looks pretty much like any other lulav. So if it turns out that you wind up with mine, it's a gift because otherwise you're not fulfilling the mitzvah, right? The following day, they would arise and come, and the officers would throw the lulavim before them, and they would grab them, and people would hurt their fellows in the scramble, right? The great lulav riot of 2312. Hey, and when the Beit Din saw that they would come to dangerous circumstances, right? In other words, because Jews, right? What are you gonna do, right? And obviously, we don't want people getting hurt in the great lulav and etrog scrum, right? So we will eliminate the great lulav and etrog scrum. But here, which is fine, right? If something is dangerous, right, you don't do it. And frankly, a lulav, you could put an eye on, right? But you really could put an eye on, right, with a lulav, okay? Having lived on a kibbutz where we grew dates, I can tell you, you can seriously injure yourself, okay? Don't ask me how I know. But you can, so they said, all right, no more great lulav scramble. But how did they do it? They said everybody should perform the mitzvah of taking the lulav in his own house. As opposed to what? We won't do the lulav on Shabbat, right? Which is now, right, what we do. We don't do it on Shabbat, but back then they still did it on Shabbat. They just said, everybody just do it at home, right? Because now, and here's the thing, is that, right, there is a certain time in the service where we do it, right? But it's not tied to that, right? And so, Chabad will, not on Shabbat, but right, have you done lulav and etrog, right? They'll have a sukkah meal or whatever. I mean, they go from house to house, right? Because there is no, in other words, if you do lulav and etrog and it's not during Hallel, fine, you still fulfill the mitzvah, right? So, nowadays, look, there are a lot of things, everything in the service up to Nishmat or Yishtabah was originally meant to be said at home. why is it now to the shul? I mean, we don't anymore, we got, but we did until very recently, right? Because the rabbis couldn't monitor that people were really saying it at home. So they said, we'll do it in the shul instead, right? So I don't know how they felt that they could monitor that people were really doing lulav and etrog at home on Shabbat instead of in the temple, but they felt that they could. Again, I don't know, but that is, I find it again interesting as a matter of historical fact that they didn't eliminate it. They simply, and they also didn't say, by the way, to bring it to the Temple Mount on Shabbat, even though Jerusalem is a walled city. And therefore it's an Hebrew and you couldn't have it, right? But they, again, maybe because they didn't want people to get used to carrying on Shabbat. I'm not quite sure, but I find, like I say, to me, like the Great Lulav Scramble is interesting. And the solution that the Beit Din came up with is also interesting, of not abolishing lulav and etrog on Shabbat, but telling people to do it in their house instead. Questions, comments? If not, we're going. So Shabbat Shalom.